All right. Welcome, everyone. How are you doing? It is Wednesday, July 6th, 2022. I don't get to do these often enough. And you can find me here at Twitter. You can find me at Substack. It's Radix Journal at Substack. Those are the main places. But I hope everyone is doing well. I this is a anything goes broadcast. You can ask me anything. I usually start out with a little bit of a monologue. I'll just say a few words about the Highland Park shooting that happened on the 4th of July. Obviously, a grotesque event. And we'll see if you guys want to talk about that or talk about really anything else. In terms of issues of gun control or anything like that, I have said my piece. Again, you can find a long monologue on that issue, which I think is rather nuanced at Substack. I am curious about the person who did this, and I would say that I was taking care of my kids and celebrating the fourth, and we don't have a lot of information, so I'm just delving into it. But I hate to say this because it sounds almost flippant, but it's almost as if the shooter is like has something for everyone in terms of mass derangement. And I will be rather cautious in coming to any conclusions about him, but there are just some very odd things about all of it. He fits the profile of the mass shooter, the angry, dispossessed, listless, drifting young man. And so that is not terribly surprising. He is a rap artist of some kind. What I found fascinating about him is that he seemed to at the very least be obsessed with Trumpism. Now, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, he's a Trump killer," and hate breeds hate, and I've seen just stuff like that. Um, I think a lot of that needs to be put into context. So there are a number of images that I saw from his that were taken from his social media profiles before they were taken down by the media companies. And he's at Trump rallies dressed like Where's Waldo, and he had a very scrawny, gaunt, kind of, very nerdy quality to his face. And so he was taking part in these rallies, and you could tell Trumpism meant something to him. But then he almost went to them as this weird outsider. It's the Where's Waldo? And from what we also learned, this event was premeditated, to say the least. He seemed to be thinking about it for a very long time. And granted, we have the benefit of retrospection, but you can see hints at this in his work, his artistic output. I've seen a very just terrifying, again in events, music video that he created where he was in a school, and obviously a school, classroom in itself is, perfectly innocuous, but just with this very weird alienated character, it, it just immediately gave school shooter vibes. I mean, even regardless of the event that ultimately took place. So he seemed, and then there are other videos where he's doing some kind of animation, and it's he brings this out. It's just truly creepy and frightening stuff. I saw some place where he was obsessed with the number 4 and the number 7. Seven is obviously a classic number to be obsessed with for a number of reasons. It's the Sabbath and other things. I saw somewhere of four and seven is a white supremacist code. I mean, I have never heard that before, but who knows? Um, and then he also seemed to have at least been photographed in the Pepe the Frog like gear. So it was evoking 2016 and all of that kind of stuff. Now, Pepe had been a icon on 4chan for many different reasons, long before the alt right. So, but wearing it now, it just does seem to evoke the Grapers, Trump culture, 4chan, etc. It's hard not for it to evoke that. So I don't know what to say other than I don't think that his brief encounters with Trumpism really caused him to do this act. But there does seem to, it seems to be that a certain type of deranged mind is attracted to Trumpism, or just that whole online, the 4chan sphere. Another aspect of this is that, and many people have noted this, is that he was engaging in a shooting in Highland Park, which is a very white, very well-to-do suburb of Chicago. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a very strange thing for a white supremacist to do, which is to attack a kind of bastion of white privilege. But then again, maybe it's not so strange in this mind. It's a kind of lashing out. I mean, the school shooter is lashing out at his friends, and in the worst way possible. I mean, maybe this is a similar thing of being kind of attracted to the Trump movement, even its whiff of white nationalism, but then ultimately in pretty horrible ways. So, as you can tell, I'm being rather uh, cursory, let's say, I'm rather cautious because we simply don't know enough. And he is, I mean, he's been charged with these crimes, but they are still allegations. He's confessed to them as well. Um, there's one more thing before I bring on some speakers. Just to cure his family. He apparently out back in like his uncle, and also his father, because he was young, he was under 21. His father actually signed off on his purchase of a weapon. It might have been the semiotic weapon. I can't quite remember. So there was a little bit of familial facilitation in this. I mean, or at least a whiff of it. I don't want to blame the parents or anything like that because, or the his uncle, because obviously, kids, they can live in a world of their own, and maybe the parents should know what's going on, but particularly when they're that age, it's hard to. Um, I would say that interview with his uncle really struck me as odd and a bit suspicious. His uncle, when he was asked by the media, the first thing he said was the last time I saw him. And I guess I'm kind of an amateur uh, linguistic analyst or something like this. But one thing I have learned is that in when police get 911 calls, and the first thing that the person says is an alibi, it is a real tip off that you should be a bit suspicious about this person. If someone calls and says, "Oh my God, I was outside mowing the lawn, and then I came in and I found my grandfather, he had had a heart attack or something." Well, look, of course, that very well could have happened, but just the fact that the first place you go is to an alibi is, um, again, highly suspicious. Maybe if I had used X, maybe wife in that example, you would get the picture of my own grandfather. That was the first thing he said was a kind of alibi the last time I talked with him. The first thing you should say in a 911 call is to plead for help. Say, you got to help my wife or, my neighbor or something, send the police immediately. That's a, um, proper response. Giving an alibi is not. And I don't know. I hate to, pretend that I could be a detective seeing one media interview, but it was rather odd. Um, anyway, there it is. I don't want to go too much into too much depth on this. Again, we just don't know enough, and we might very well never know. All right, I will let you guys in. You can respond to this stuff or talk about something else entirely. Jeff, you were the first to jump in.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for accepting my
Um,
request.
sure.
I wanted to ask you about pan-Europeanism, if that's okay.
Sure. You don't want to talk about Highland Park
Oh,
at
we
all.
can, we can, we can. I think that gun control is kind of a silly topic for, like, there's mental health things that we can talk about, but I think gun control is a little overplayed at this point because it seems like it's kind of
Yeah.
a low IQ talking point for right wingers when it's a little silly.
Well, I've said my piece on it. I mean, I think it's an interesting issue, but yeah, I agree. So go ahead, Pan
Okay,
Europeanism.
so I I respect your viewpoint on it, but like I don't see the point of pan-Europeanism if it includes like Moldova and Macedonia and these countries because I think if you look at like the great European countries, it would not include like these like Eastern European nations. And I'm curious your thoughts kind of on that.
Well, I mean, if you're dealing with the existing nation states as they are, you're dealing with people from Pakistan and Turkey and elsewhere.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess, I think we should be kind of realistic about this and not just kind of create ideal scenarios. Yeah, I mean, I can kind of get it. I do think that that would probably be a good problem to have if that is what we're dealing with. Is those damn Moldovans. So I don't. I mean, I do get it. I guess what interests me more as a critique of pan Europeanism is the Russia question and I guess, the Slav question in that sense. Um, so uh, this East-West divide, particularly around Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine as a hotspot is not uh, some coincidence or anything like that. There really is a major geographic factor as you move into uh, Eurasia, and Ukraine is a kind of bottleneck scenario in the sense that north of Russia, you're dealing with icy plains, and so you enter this mass plains area, the steppes, and Ukraine acts as a kind of bottleneck. And so there are going to be different power centers, and Ukraine really is going to be a gateway to Europe and a gateway to Asia, in effect. And whether a kind of like east west divide can actually be bridged, whether that's possible, because we see these east west divides come up, to I know it's not perfect exactly, but a kind of Catholicism and Protestantism versus Orthodoxy, and obviously the Cold War. And is there a deep geographic quality that makes like pan-Europeanism in that sense, like from, Lisbon to Vladivostok or something like this, uh, is that just simply impossible? And that in terms of real pan-Europeanism, we should focus on where it is happening and is kind of most realistically possible. And that would be a French and German led European Union.
Speaking,
Those are the big daddy countries. They're the ones that are, I would say, culturally, and I mean, throw Italy in as well. Italy's a bit of a strange case. But culturally, linguistically, um, ideologically, at least in terms of France and German philosophically, um, musically, um, they're just a dominant sphere. They're these just indispensable nations, and they are big nations. I mean, I don't know. All nationalisms aren't the same. If you say you're a Welsh nationalist, that has a very different quality in terms of the way it's received than being saying I'm a German nationalist, or God forbid, I'm a pan-German nationalist. So I do think that like a Western and Central Europe recognizing an East-West divide in Ukraine is a just a more realistic thing. So we're not just talking in hypotheticals about, you know, one day, from Siberia to Portugal, we'll have a, Holy Roman Empire or something. That's just kind of, it's fine to talk about it, but it's a bit like intellectual masturbation. It doesn't have any grounding. And I think if there's going to be a grounding, it would be with France and Germany.
that's a good answer. Speaking of Eastern Europe, I have a question. So, I'm like mostly English and German stock, kind of. I think that's similar to you, like old
Uh-huh.
stock of that.
Yeah.
And I've noticed, like, I'm Protestant. I'm Protestant Christian. I'm Lutheran specifically. And I've noticed there's a lot of like Americans, even like white Americans who are English, who like convert to become a trad cath or like an ortho bro.
Yeah.
What do you? A lot of like, I guess, groypers specifically. What do you think of that kind of phenomenon among like online right wingers converting to Catholicism or Orthodoxy?
Before I answer that, could I ask a question? Have we ever met before?
No, I don't believe so.
It's funny. Maybe it's just the way you speak. It's like a regional accent. It rings a bell, but I don't know who. I was like,
I'm from
I
the
feel like
great
I've
state of
heard your
Indiana.
voice. Okay, cool. Sorry, that was a mere curiosity. I'm not trying to
No, no,
dox or
yeah, yeah.
anything. You could have answered that yes or no. Okay. I think it's absolutely stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, first off, in terms of the like groypers or whatever, I mean, give me a break. These people, I mean, if I imagine that I might go to church more than they do, and they understand Catholicism or whatever it is as this in this kind of reactionary form where it's like, oh, the left hates this,
Right.
you know, like, the left likes abortion, therefore we support kitchens and no shoes therein. It's just this really stupid reaction in that sense. And it's not like a true understanding of Christianity. And it's not even kind of trad in the sense of it being the, religion of your dad and grandpa or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's completely silly.
It's funny because
But
in Catholics and Orthodox in America are more liberal than Protestants are, but for some
yeah,
reason, like all these trad people can't like their brains can't wrap their minds around that.
right. No, that is very clear on just basic stuff. I think Mormons might be the most conservative,
Yes.
um, but yes, evangelical Christians, and I think even like mainline Protestants are more conservative than
Yeah.
Catholics.
Mainline like Anglicans, Episcopalians, and like Lutherans are still more conservative than Catholics are. And a lot of that's because of like Mexicans, but still, like if this was this great conservative thing, Catholicism, you would think that a lot of these Mexicans would be more conservative than they really are.
Yeah, definitely. Well,
Yep.
and Mexicans are, again, increasingly attracted to the GOP, but that's another story. Um, yeah, I think it goes deeper than just the Orthodox bros or groypers, because converting to Catholicism has been a rite of passage in the American right for a very long time, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I would actually even, well, the conversion is interesting. But so you had people establishing even the notion of conservatism. And there's a funny thing, I think, election of in the election of 1960, I believe that I'll, I'll go back and check this, but bear with me. It demonstrates the kind of like semantic fluidity of all this. But um, Richard Nixon referred to himself as a fighting liberal, and I think Kennedy referred to himself as like a visionary conservative, or they both had these kind of like contradictory phrases. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, so it was like the Democrats were like, "Oh, I'm a compassionate conservative" or something like that, and then Nixon's like, "I'm a fighting liberal." So it shows that those words just hadn't really like hadn't been fastened down yet. But in the around that time, in the mid '50s on, with founding of National Review, you had either Catholics in charge of the movement, and National Review from like 1950, like to say 19, let's say 80, it was an ideological magazine. I mean, they weren't exactly pleased with Richard Nixon. And I think they said, we prefer Ike as opposed to we like Ike. So they were not happy. Um, and it was a kind of, I don't know, I hate to say this, it's kind of alt-right in a way. It was a high level, a little bit academic, ideological magazine. Now they also took strong stands. They came out in favor of segregation, at least for the time being, and whatever. But it had a Catholic quality. The Catholic conversions and Catholics on the Supreme Court. I mean, I don't think this phenomenon can really be underestimated at this point. So,
Yeah.
from what I understand, Gorsuch was a cradle Catholic, but then attends his wife's Anglican or Episcopalian church. But the rest are just clearly Catholics. And like Gorsuch is a kind, or not Gorsuch, Kavanaugh is a kind of, go along to get along Washington neocon type, but he's Catholic. Alito seems deeply sincere and the kind of like most sincere conservative ideologue. Thomas, ditto. And who else am I forgetting?
Roberts.
Oh, Amy Comey Roberts, more like Kavanaugh, go along, get along. And then Coney Barrett is just kind of this dim-witted Catholic lady. But she was also, she was involved in this like weird, like uniquely American Catholic, like Pentecostal Catholic, if that makes sense. So
That's the same thing that Mike Pence is.
Oh God, yeah, and didn't he convert to evangelicalism? But as an Irishman,
so he's from my state. So he was originally Catholic until he was in his 20s, and then in college he converted to kind of evangelicalism. But he still is like, I think, registered as a Catholic, and he calls himself an evangelical Catholic, which is very clear that I think he's just ambitious, and he knows that most of Indiana is Protestant. So he's like, oh yeah, I'm a Catholic Protestant, which is like totally gibberish, but
mega church Catholic, the most mega of churches.
Mm-hmm.
But she went to this church where, I mean, it became notorious and almost like a liberal meme, but it's true. So it was this weird place where the women were called handmaids, and they would like swear their subservience to their husband. And it wasn't, even though it sounds like it's inspired by Handmaid's Tale, I don't think it was. And then they kind of like changed that after the Handmaid's Tale was on, Hulu or whatever, and they're like, oh, we better change the title of women. But it also featured charismatic preachers and speaking in tongues. So it was just this like grab bag of nonsense. It was like the Catholics wanted to get in on the Pentecostal like fun or something. I mean, again, I just read one article on it and I was like, oh my God, this is actually real.
Yeah.
But so there you go. But yeah, I mean, the Catholic quality of the conservative movement just can't be underestimated. And I don't again, I don't know if there's something to it. I mean, the other aspect to it, which is interesting. So you had National Review from, like, let's say 1955 up to 1980. And then you had this creation of the religious right with Paul Weyrich, where you had Catholics leading Protestants. And so the GOP voting base was Protestant. It was mainline, and then, with evangelical Christianity booming. But then you had these kind of high church people leading them and bringing in their own interests. So, I mean, it's now actually kind of fairly well known. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention endorsed the Roe v. Wade decision, and they endorsed it on its own grounds. They said
Yeah.
this is about a right to privacy and a doctor's decision. People forget Roe v. Wade was a little more like patronizing or paternalistic. It was almost a way of protecting doctors. Like it was basically saying, like, kind of laying out the ground rules for physicians in a way. Like, it wasn't exactly the go get them women's rights thing that it's depicted as. And then Casey in 1991, it again, certified it in the 14th Amendment. It was basically saying, like, we have this notion of there's some place that government can't go, and this includes abortion. So, I mean, I think it's a fairly coherent and compelling case, to be honest. But the Catholics were the only ones who opposed abortion. And so you had these, like, more intelligent Catholics and Catholic converts leading the kind of the rubes of, like, Baptist and so on. And, I've met, actually, even last week, I met very cool and intelligent guy who's from a Southern Baptist tradition, but you know what I'm talking about. Low
Right.
church Protestantism. There's a lot of,
It's kind of low IQ, but we love them at the same time.
not in all cases. But so I don't know what it is. I mean, I could explain it as, like, a personal thing, in the sense of, like, if you're making it in the conservative movement, you do have some level of intelligence. And so you kind of want to justify what you're doing through smells and bells and, this grand tradition and so on. I don't know. There's obviously the National Review thing with Buckley. I could go on. I don't know if there's something deeper to it. Whether it's a kind of signal of something, I don't quite know. Maybe Brahman, who's listening, could jump in on this. He actually requested. I'll let him in.
Another thing I wanted to mention is, like, historically, like, Catholics and Jews, if you look at kind of the demise of kind of like white policies in some countries, like in America, the Hart-Celler Immigration Act was done by a Catholic and a Jew. In South Africa, apartheid was ended by mostly Catholics and Jews. The White Australia policy was ended by Catholics and Jews. There's sort of a thing where, like, ethnic whites who are mostly Catholic move to these Anglo countries and then kind of don't see themselves completely as these old stock Anglos did in these countries, and kind of subvert it in some ways.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't think that's really talked about enough.
Well, even on not, like, putting aside any suggestion of, like, conspiracy or personal, conversion story, like, just the fact that there are all these Catholics on the Supreme Court is shocking. And it's kind of funny. I was thinking about this as well. I need to just write this up as, like, a tweet storm. But there's this weird, like, like, the Supreme Court almost expresses the problems of Christian religion in America, like, in a nutshell. And so it's called originalism. Well, first off, the founding fathers would be shocked and perhaps horrified to learn that the court is dominated by Catholics. Like, that,
Totally.
it's kind of funny to, like, be like, oh, the founding fathers, right? I mean, I'm not that they were anti-Catholic exactly, but you get the point. They would certainly be surprised to learn about this. But so you have this, like, Catholic cause of ending abortion, which has been the dominating ideology of the Federalist Society. I mean, the Federalist Society would not exist without this. And this like Leonardo Leo character who I read about in various left-wing magazines. I mean, this guy is raising $100 million over the past 2 years to effectively to end Roe v. Wade. I mean, the guy it's just insane. And he's a member of Opus Dei and so on. There is a network of Catholics interested in this. But then their justification is fundamentalism. And so it's this kind of like, those words are sacred text, and they're plainly written and freely given, like no interpretation necessary. It says, where is abortion in the Constitution? I don't see it anywhere, therefore you don't have a right to it. So it's, which of course, I forgot which amendment it was. The Ninth Amendment puts everything else to the states. What is it? Oh, that's a 10th Amendment. Which is the amendment that says basically anything that we don't say, you should assume is free. It's actually I'll go look it up.
I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. So it's basically, if you say for the people, in law is about prohibition, it's not as if the law has to it doesn't prescribe what you can do. It can only prohibit what you can't. Anyway, so you have this combination of fundamentalist thinking and textual fetishism about the Constitution, led by these Catholics who shouldn't, at least presumably, be thinking in those directions. And so it's a very odd thing. And, I would say myself, I mean, the founding fathers never imagined bullets. They never imagined the internet. They never imagined all sorts of things. I mean, if we were to have a constitution in the future, I think it should be a living constitution in the sense of we have some values that are articulated, and we will apply those to new things that come up in life. I mean, conservatives hate when people talk like this, but that's how reasonable people talk. It's how you live your life.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just wondering, do you think that also the size of the government now, I mean, comparatively to when the Constitution was being written, kind of prohibits it from being a living document? But obviously that's what people, want to say. It's quote unquote a living document because of the amendment process. But the size of our government right now currently kind of prohibits us from actually being able to make it a living document that has consistent changes and makes it easy to make changes like that.
Well, I mean, why do you believe that the founding fathers were in total opposition to what we have?
Can you say that again? I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, I mean, you're basically saying that because the government is so big, we can't have strict constitutionalism. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm more so what I'm saying is, when the Constitution was written, it was, 13 states. The government obviously was large in size at the time, but comparative to now, hundreds and hundreds of members, kind of make it, as opposed to it being a simple thing for being like, hey, let's propose an amendment, and it being kind of a quick process to it being, having to go through a lot of loopholes, and with just the size of it now, committees, all that kind of stuff actually prevent it from being a living document. Does that make sense?
You're using living constitution in a different way than I used it. I was saying living in the sense that there are some basic principles and then you apply them. You're saying something, a little bit different. I mean, I understand that, but I don't think the founding fathers were necessarily opposed to a global empire, to be honest. And I mean, Jefferson himself radically expanded the size of the country. So he was not he wanted growth. In the Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances is the crown is preventing immigration. into the country. So I don't know what to say. I mean, I think there's this kind of notion like that the founding fathers would have hated what's done now or something. I'm not sure I agree with that. You can obviously never know.
Yeah, that's really honestly an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about it like that.
I have another question, Richard. Where do you side on the Jefferson versus Hamiltonian, or like Democrat Republican versus Federalist debates?
Well, probably with Hamiltonianism, but again, I mean, Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. France was broke at the time, and he got an amazing deal. So I think, I mean, I think you can think about those two ideas kind of more like in principle of, you know, a Jeffersonian vision of yeoman farmers and small government and so on, and then a Hamiltonian vision of a stronger state and even empire and colonies and banking and so on. I probably side more with Hamilton.
That makes sense. I feel like in some ways we got kind of the worst of both worlds, where it's like we got like the big state of Hamilton, but with like the universal democracy of Jefferson, where it's like we didn't really pick either side, right? We kind of did a little bit of both, and then it ended up with the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. I just think there are just really problematic ideas promoted by particularly the Declaration of Independence, and I mean the Constitution as well, which is this kind of like clock, you know, this watchmaker mechanism that does have so many checks and balances that it does seem to prevent decisions. The Declaration of Independence, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people key in on the all men are created equal and how ridiculous that is or something, particularly for a slave owner to say. I mean, it's almost grotesque. But yeah, I mean, I think it's much worse than that. I think there's this kind of like with popular sovereignty, there's this almost open-ended quality. And so both the Declaration and the Constitution are stressing popular sovereignty on some level. They're saying, in the course of human events, we decide to break these bonds, and then obviously we the people is the key aspect to the beginning of the Constitution. So they're declaring popular sovereignty. The people have this power, and they give a theory of government that, you know, we're all free, but we decide kind of in a rational fashion to give away a little liberty and maybe give away some money and taxes so that we could have a kind of a police force that could, keep everything together. It is a really absurd notion, Lockean notion. And no government was ever created like that. And it just gives this kind of rational calculus where America really is open-ended. You know, like I'm not that surprised that America would ultimately like give birth to all of these crazy deconstructive ideologies and ultimately like gender deconstruction, because there's no real end goal set in mind. And the sovereign entity is just the people and whatever they want and think. And, you know, even in terms of like free speech, it's why I've never really been, it's very hard for me to be a free speech advocate. First off, free speech was not practiced in the way that it has been now post, like, you know, Oliver Wendell Holmes. You were not allowed to harshly criticize the government, particularly in times of crisis. But this notion, even Holmes, like writing his dissent, which actually didn't prevail. We're going back to the First World War. I think it's 1918. But he basically said, like, the United States is it's an experiment. And we're just going to kind of figure it out as we go along. And who am I to say that these communist pamphleteers have it wrong? Maybe we should hear them out. It's just this kind of like open-ended, chaotic notion of what something can be. I mean, when the people are sovereign in this particular sense, it is kind of like whatever they want. It's like whoever they vote for, whatever speech they're interested in, whatever culture they're interested in. It's just if you have a decent population, that can be fine, but it just does inherently lead to chaos. And it, I think, does inherently lead to where we are today. You have to look at history as logical in some sense, as about ideas, but it is also real. Like, this is where we are. And so you have to blame the founding fathers for our state of affairs. And you can't just keep saying, like, they'd be rolling in their graves or whatever if they knew. The fact is, the Constitution they created has either put up zero resistance to the current state of affairs, or it has in fact facilitated the state of affairs that we have today. I mean, those are the two options. And so you really have to blame Jefferson at some level. And you can't just get away with like singing the praises of the founders or something. I mean, maybe they got it right in certain ways. I think I actually do think that. But maybe they really got it wrong on some key ways.
Another funny thing about the founding fathers is like when right wingers talking about the founding fathers, they're always like, these guys were like colorblind people who just wanted to see Americans be free. Whereas left wingers were like, these were racist, white supremacist, like far right people. And the left is way more correct on that than the right is. Like,
well, but it's complicated though. So obviously you have a lot of slave owners. And so it is absurd to say that they were like liberals. And the other thing is, I think it even gets worse. The 3/5 clause in the Constitution about enumerating non-free people is pretty remarkable, because that is radically misunderstood by historians, and it was definitely misunderstood in my textbook. I remember this distinctly. There was a picture of a black man in my textbook, and part of him was cut off, like missing or something, and it was like, he's only 3/5 of a human being or whatever. So the 3/5 was about enumerating slaves, and so northern non-slave holders did not want to count slaves at all, and it was Southerners who wanted to get 3/5 so that they could bolster their numbers and have more power, particularly in the House of Representatives and the presidency. And so counting them at all was actually the thing. So there is a kind of white supremacy element of like, look at me, a plantation owner lording over dozens or hundreds of Africans along with my colleagues here. And they're all counted. So that's why our state has a greater share of the pie in the Electoral College in the House of Representatives. And you have this like many Southern presidents who won due to the slave power, basically. So it is kind of white supremacist, maybe in the most horrible way of like, yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot of problems with these people that we should look into. And I don't know, the kind of popular sovereignty, I think, is a real issue. And then the kind of like quaint, enlightened humanism on the part of plantation owners is just, it's absurd.
Yeah. It's kind of funny, the Northerners that blame the South. Like, they're like, you're the ones that let the blacks into the country in the first place. And then, like, I also think we got, like, the worst of both worlds in that, because, like, the North got their vision of, like, freeing the slaves, and then they all flooded into cities like Detroit and Chicago. And then, like, prior to that, Detroit and Chicago were, like, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful cities. But but the North wanted those slaves because it was like cheap labor. Because at the time, that was their cheap labor was like Southern blacks and then like ethnic whites from like Italy and Poland.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of problems and people making decisions. Like it's almost like the notion of popular sovereignty takes away a notion of a race or something. It actually isn't like I think a lot of maybe white nationalists would be like, oh yeah, popular sovereign, like the people have power or something. Well, it's like we have a constitution in which that's in this, what is it, the second paragraph for opening lines? I think there's actually one paragraph. Anyway, it's the opening lines. So like, where has that gotten you?
I have another.
I don't know. You can rearrange the people and expand them and contract them and all sorts of things.
So you talked about secession before and like national divorce and how you're against it. Like, would you be at all open if this happened to like some black ethno state in the Deep South becoming a thing? Because like moving blacks from like Chicago to like Alabama, would you be at all?
I mean, look, I think this is just so hypothetical because there is no, outside of maybe like no impulse towards that. And I would say a couple of things. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm against sex.
For some reason, you're kind of cutting out.
I don't see it as
Mark Brauman, can you hear what he's saying?
I can't hear him. No, yeah. He's cutting out. Richard, we can't hear you. I just wanted to let you know. I don't know if you can hear us. Presumably you can. Yeah, let me return to the pan-European question. I think that the issue there, and I'm a pan-Europeanist, but in fact I'm more than that. But I think that I'm a global Aryanist or an Aryan globalist. But I think that petty nationalism is something that is just not. It's just not long for the world ultimately, and the reason for that is because we live in a global world, and really the challenge is ultimately a challenge of culture, and I would say as well religion. But the reason that petty nationalism, I mean, to the extent it exists now, I mean, mostly it's civic nationalism to the extent that it's politically viable, for example, as we see in France. But the culture there, or the ethos there, is ultimately a global culture, which is the culture that essentially the globe shares, which is a multiculture, as it were, or a culture that venerates multiculturalism or holds that as a kind of sacred taboo. So I think that petty nationalism in general is not viable without a sort of broader or without a kind of change in that global culture, as it were. So in other words, culture and religion are things that are always going to be sort of larger than petty states, right? So in other words, ultimately that's kind of the root of any sort of change that we would see civilizationally, is a change in the religion and then the culture, and that by definition it wouldn't really have borders. It would be something that would go beyond borders. So I mean I think that a kind of a localist or a petty nationalist mindset is one that is I just don't